'cause the future is now.
So welcome to the webinar. I'm John Stubbard. I'll be passing over to the team in a moment to introduce themselves. Yeah, I think we should have Max, Caitlin and Will all with us. So guys, if you'd like to get ready to come in and say hello, bring yourselves in on camera when you're ready. Fantastic, great to see you all. I'll pass it across to yourselves now, and I will see you all in about sort of 35 minutes or so with any questions that people may have asked.
Brilliant. Who'd like to introduce themselves first?
I'll volunteer. So I'm Will, one of the implementation consultants here at Compleat. So I'll be a very familiar face with our customers out on site. I hold their hands through the implementations from the initial requirements gathering all the way through to design and build of the software and taking users through end user training and getting them live.
Okay, so I'm Max Kent, Vice President of Global Procurement, looking after our digital procurement division and strategy around how we go to market with our customers for procurement software, price changing, price benchmarking, savings and analysis of data. So some of you may know me from LinkedIn and YouTube. You might have seen those online as we increase our marketing efforts. So looking forward to speaking with you all today.
Excellent. And hi everyone, my name is Caitlin and I've been at Compleat for about 2.5 years now, so a while. And I work with companies in the UK and Europe around their AP automation and P2P projects. And my role really is to work with clients and companies to understand their business requirements from these kind of solutions and then work with them through the initial stages all the way through to the end of the project. So that's kind of my realm.
Okay, so first topic we have on the agenda is around planning an automation project. So I think one of the first places to start here is probably from the start of the process. So I guess, Caitlin, from your perspective, when you start talking to people about this kind of subject, what's the first sort of questions they ask you?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely a back and forth questions both sides. So I think there's a lot of information that we like to gather from clients in the first stages, because I think that really sets a precedence for how the project will run from there. So a lot of the questions that we ask will be around, what's the current process when it comes to AP? How are you processing invoices? What's your purchasing process look like? That kind of thing. Are you working with any systems internally already that you might like to integrate moving forward? But also, I guess the most important part of that initial conversation is around what's the most important thing that these teams are trying to gain from this type of project. What's the end goal? Is there a focus on a particular element? Is there a focus on part of the manual process that's ongoing at the moment? And then we would, work with them from there to align what we do with what they're looking for.
Yeah, I think we're seeing more and more businesses coming into this sort of space where they haven't had an automation software in place, certainly for those sort of financial processes. So it's really interesting to see more and more businesses engage with us and look to this sort of technology to automate their processes. Well, from your point of view then, in terms of when you get into those implementations, are you still coming across a lot of people that don't know how to plan for these sort of projects or aren't used to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get a handover from a sales team, so I know roughly the objectives of the project and what the customer is trying to achieve. But quite typically, when I turn up on site for that initial meeting and beginning of the requirements gathering, the team that are in front of me may not necessarily have been fully involved in that sales cycle. So I'll be asking the questions again. One of the first questions I'll be asking is what is the objective with this project? What are they trying to achieve, and why have they bought that software? So that I have an end goal that I can design the project to achieve. So it's quite interesting what people will turn up to that initial meeting. Sometimes the projects are completely finance led, and that will get me a little bit nervous typically straight away, because I need to know that we're going to get user buy-in. We need to engage people who are going to be using that software. So I would always ask for them to bring in people from the business so that we get an idea of what the business want from the software, not just finance, because those objectives may be different.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's something that finance do quite often, is look at a project purely from a finance perspective, which is a lot of what we do, but it's not the full process. So it's good to bring in additional departments, additional people, end users, as you say, Will, so that we can qualify what's important to them initially and make sure that there's still a focus on that, as we go through, and that it isn't going to be completely finance led.
Yeah, and a lot of customers we come across are first-time users to this type of software. So what you're bringing in is quite a lot of cultural change to a business. You may be asking users to do things that they've never had to do before as part of their role. And to get that buy-in, you need to make sure they're involved in the decision-makings early doors, so that they actually end up enjoying using the software, and it does make their job easier.
Yeah.
Do you see lots of pushback from end users? Because I think one of the objections we come across is that when finance implement this kind of software, the end users will then say, well, your finance team are pushing this work onto the end users, and shouldn't they be doing this work? When, actually we know this is them taking ownership of their own budgets and their own ordering. So do you see that sort of pushback when you actually get to train the end users?
Yeah, it does depend on the departments. The more sort of operational departments and those guys that are out in the field tend to push this back and say it's not really their responsibility, because they see it as a means of doing work for the finance team. And, in a way, we are pushing some of that workload back out to the business, because what we would typically do for our requisitioners, those raising the orders, we're trying to get those guys to understand some financial coding, maybe the chart of accounts. They've never had to cover that before. They've just done their role, bought what they need to cover their role, and they've not got interested in the sort of accounting side of things. But we're asking people at a very early stage to set basically a commitment against a budget. So that is something that will scare a lot of people that have not got involved with that sort of language before, commitments and accruals and this sort of things. But it's important that we collect that information early on for the finance team to do their sort of cash management and things. But there's ways in which we can set the software up so that although the coding is still a requirement at that early stage, we build it into perhaps the user group that they belong to. We tailor it specifically to a team out in the field where maybe they've only got 2 or 3 different budget codes to pick from. So the more information we can gather on how each of these individual teams works, the easier we can make it for them to use the software, so we don't end up confusing people who haven't seen this type of software before.
Yeah, I think the message here is that although these technologies are relatively new to some businesses, it is the way the world is going. And I think, having manual processes in the finance team to automate things around AP will stop being a sort of nice to have and be just an essential part of business very soon. And we can see that shift happening already. It's not, I think what we're saying here is it's not the scary world as people think it is. We do a lot of hand holding through it. So I think, again, Kate, from your point of view, just keen to know how, what sort of, not objections necessarily, but sort of fears people have when they're talking to you about it. Yes, they want to go with the software and they want to engage with us, but they still will have those kind of reservations about what they don't know.
Yeah, I think it's really the importance of working with these companies and really putting, testing things, trialing things, that kind of thing is really important. Because it's, as you say, well, when you do get, people who are out in the field who, maybe they call up suppliers at the moment to raise orders, maybe they've got, existing relationships, some people that we work with are still working from, manual purchase order books and forms that they're filling out. And I guess the objections come up when you haven't worked successfully potentially with a group of people. You haven't understood why it is that they wouldn't want to do that, why that would be difficult for them, what time would that add on to their process as it is at the moment. But it's almost about flipping that on its head a bit to say, if you do work with finance slightly more, what could you gain from that process? You're not going to get chased by finance potentially for where things are outstanding. You're going to have more visibility over what's been approved potentially, so you can see that everything that you're doing is in line with finance's process. So I think it's an education both sides to make sure that everyone understands what the benefits are going to be for them, so that those objections can be handled and overcome really.
What I often find as well is out in the business, they're managing budgets to a much more granular level than the accountants are. So the accountants may have one code for IT expenditure, for example, but when you go out to the business, they are monitoring their spend maybe at a project level, and those projects have no place in the finance system, in the management accounts. So what our software would let them do, if we knew if that requirement is, we could actually monitor their spend against projects against that IT spend. So finance would be getting the information they want because they just want it at that sort of parent level, whereas out in the business they can monitor their spend against specific projects which fall underneath that umbrella. So it's that sort of information we need early on, so we're keeping both sides happy.
Yeah.
Are there any sort of pitfalls or particular departments you think that have to be communicated with more, that are outside of finance, where if they're not kept in the loop from day one, they could potentially scupper the project further down the line because they haven't been kept in the loop? So I know that communication is key, but is there any sort of pitfalls to look out for, or any particular people to engage more with?
I guess from an IT department point of view, is they've already got lots of systems they're looking after, and they may have other pieces of software that could perform certain parts of this functionality. So getting those guys involved to understand what software is currently owned by the customer is important, because noses could get put out of joint if we bring in a new system that suddenly is going to sort of overlay another bit of software they're already using. So getting feedback and getting buy-in from IT is always important in this type of project.
Yeah, I think integrations get more and more complex the sort of the larger the organization you work with, and we've seen a lot of legacy systems in place, as you rightly say, that may do parts of the job role, but no one in the procurement or finance team working on the start of the project knew they even existed. So it's those things I think can be a factor. It's just having that communication, as you say, I think across departments, isn't it, to involve it all. So would you normally have a planning session or some sort of meeting to implement that you were on site with and actually drawing together those departments?
Yeah, so the initial meeting is typically just with the project owner and their select group of staff. During that meeting, I would encourage them to bring in further people for the next meeting. I think whoever the project sponsor is wants to maintain control of their main objective, but it certainly doesn't harm getting our guys in from the business at an early stage, particularly before you put the system in front of them. Because if we go through a whole planning stage and put a design together just with that finance team, and then we put that system in front of business users, you're going to get huge scope creep. Suddenly you're going to have all these requirements hit you that you hadn't thought of in that initial phase. And that doesn't do anyone any favors if we don't hear about those until we put the system in front of them. So I would definitely encourage that to take place before we sign off any design.
It's the overwhelm, isn't it? The overwhelm of a system put together that maybe, you haven't included everybody. So it is overwhelming. I guess that's why we would always say, our recommendation would be that you would do if you are about to undertake this kind of project. You would do your research on everything internally, externally, make sure you know what systems you've got that could integrate, maybe not don't integrate, what features they have, you know, what's out on the market that may fit what you need, what doesn't fit what you need, so that when the software is put together, it's exactly what you're looking for, and it's included everybody really in that process.
Mm.
I think some of this is working up front with the project leads in the customers and clients that you're working with to do that research up front in their own business, also in terms of the systems and solutions we're providing. You know, that we're not the only provider out there, and it doesn't mean that we're necessarily best fit for what they want, but have they done that homework up front to ensure that when they're engaging with us, they know what they're getting, and they understand why these software systems exist, what they do, and the differences between them.
Mm.
I imagine some of that comes out in the wash as well when you get further into those teams and they're asking you, does it do this? Does it do X, Y, and Z?
Mm.
Well, it's not in the original scope. So that's when that scope creep comes in, or potentially completely new changes to the spec, I would imagine.
Mm. And also this level of automation doesn't work for every type of team. I'm thinking of an example of a hotel group where you know, you have got longer term purchases where they're ordering things on a sort of monthly basis or weekly basis, and purchase ordering works very well. But when you go into the kitchen where the chef's ordering almost on a nightly basis and he doesn't know what he's ordering until that following evening, the workflow you'd have to put in for a chef is going to differ completely from the facilities department, for example. And again, if you put a system in front of a chef that had been designed for a facilities team, it's just not going to work. So, you know, I don't know whether they'd invite the chef along to a meeting, but you need to have representatives of the business that understand those potential pitfalls, because otherwise it's left up to the responsibility of someone like myself to bring that to the table. And, you know, in that first meeting, I'd be going through these sort of ideas and potential pitfalls to make a customer think about who they need to get involved and what input they need. Yeah,
it's all very well to, you know, in an ideal world, raise an order for an item and it arrives on time. The price was what it was on the order. The invoice matched correctly. They receipted it on time, and everything was perfect. But the real world says that doesn't always happen. And especially when you go into catering, you know, things can change rapidly. The food you ordered 2 days ago is now not available. You're going to get a part order. You're going to get certain things turning up. So for a chef that's busy in a kitchen, and there's lots of other areas that are similar to that, you know, they're not going to have time to just jump onto their purchasing system while their hands are covered in food, essentially, are they?
And they're certainly not going to have time to wait for someone to approve their request. So they're given a certain level of self-approval in that sort of area. So although they would still have to get a purchase order number from our system, they can just get in there and take that instantly to make an order with their supplier.
Yeah, so it's flexible. It has to be flexible with those sort of departments, I think, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, and the software, I mean, the software is so versatile, that flexibility, you know, you can go too far with that, but it's just having a good balance and understanding what balance is required.
So once we've started rolling out the solution into the business, sort of what's the next stage that happens once we've had these initial implementation calls and we've understood the scope of the project?
I think coming back to getting the users to buy in, I had a really good example last year with a housing association where they really understood what it was that they were implementing across their business, and they went to the lengths of posters in stairwells and that sort of thing, really advertising the fact what was coming and what to expect, and they made it exciting. Even to the point of the day of implementation, the whole project team had got T-shirts with slogan. I think the slogan was "Have you P2P'd?" And it was brilliant because it just brought some humour into the whole project, and everyone was asking questions. You know, when's it coming? What will it do for us? And they're just excited to use it. And that's what you need in a large-scale implementation: is the visibility of the project around the organisation, and making it an exciting event that this new bit of software is coming. So I'd always encourage that where it's possible, maybe not in smaller implementations, but, you know, a big multi-site implementation like a housing association, that was a really good idea, and it's something I'd like to see again in in the future.
I think that's brilliant. Yeah, great
It's
idea,
brilliant.
and making something of those events. You know, these things again are coming. So if you're in an organisation like that, the chances are they may have something already, and they're switching over to a new system. You would still want to make a you know, a noise about that happening, and shout about it. Really, I think that's
Definitely,
a great thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, Caitlin, in smaller implementations, it's not necessarily the same thing, because I guess you could be live in a few days with some of the smaller clients we work with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is a key difference, but it's, it's as important to build awareness internally that there is something that's coming. What we've seen recently actually was with a client that they kept the implementation really kind of central to finance, which is not a problem, but they then kind of had a staggered rollout, which then meant that different groups were having interaction with the software that hadn't previously. And because they didn't have that awareness of what was coming, they didn't really know what some of the key features of the software, were. Like, why was it being implemented? What was the gain across all departments? It kind of it leads people to not want to use it, really. And I think building that excitement around, there's something that's coming, there's something that's going to benefit all of us, is still really key to build that into smaller implementations, because ultimately, a lot of the business, if not all of the business, is going to have to use it. So it's definitely important to include everybody initially, so that we can, instead of having a central focus group, everyone can trial it, test it, we can have those feedback loops, and we can, continue the understanding, really.
And what about slightly further down the line then? So we've gone live, we've rolled out, everyone's now P2Ping, and they're all happily
They're
raising
P2P'd.
orders. So does it drift sort of 2, 3, 4 months down the line? Do these sort of best practices go out of kilter? Do they start to forget what they learned?
I think on the larger scale projects, you'd have built in maybe a phased approach, because I'd always be encouraging to keep things as simple as possible to start with. Would have built in regular reviews going forward, possibly bringing in additional functionality as and when users are up and running with the basic stuff. Particularly from a reporting side of things, you're going to hear a lot of feedback from the business about their reporting requirements once they actually start using the system and understand the type of data that it's collecting. You would definitely want a session for reporting.
That's another really good point, actually, because I think when you show new customers the sort of range of modules, services, different solutions that we could put in place, there's an element of not trying to run before you can walk, I'd imagine, isn't there? So do you
definitely
sort of throttle back on some things?
I try to throttle back as much as possible, because I've had I've got the battle scars of implementing something that's way too complicated for users to understand. So keeping things simple is always my choice. If we've got enough time in the project to have a second phase, I'd always encourage them to leave the tricky stuff to a second phase.
Yeah, and I've seen certain implementations in the past where it looks like they, despite our sort of best advice, maybe have gone a slightly different way, and we've had to then revise things. So what happens in the situation where you're sort of up against someone who thinks they know best?
It's really just listening to feedback from people around them as well, and feeding that back to the project owner. They may think they know best, but if everyone around them is telling them it's not working, then it's just a conversation that has to be had.
Yeah.
But the system is so versatile; it can be altered. It's not set in stone. We can make changes and adaptations.
Yeah.
One of the key decisions that has to be made early on in the project is whether you're going to use receipting or not. And that's a real key decision that ideally doesn't change going forward, because that is a complicated thing to introduce if you don't have it from day one. But receipting has pros and cons. From an accounting point of view, accruals is very good for getting better accrual information. But it's something that your users won't typically be used to doing. So it's weighing up the pros and cons of introducing a formal receipting process into a business if they've not used one before.
Yeah, I can see that, because if they've gone from not having a P2P tool at all, manual order acquisition process essentially, to having this system in place where everything has to go through it now, and now they've got to receive all orders manually as well, could be a step too far potentially for some business at that initial stage.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So that's something I'd bring up in the first meeting is, have you used that type of process? Do you see the value in that type of process? And if you are going to introduce it, what potential pitfalls will that have with the business users?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, I think it's just trying to go through the sort of things that to make people aware of when we engage in these sort of projects, I think, so that we've got that biggest understanding of what the business we're working with is structured, how they want to work, how they want this system to work, and what they've been told across their departments, I think. So any other sort of factors from either of you that people need to be aware of when embarking on these kind of projects?
I think for me, it's just key to understand who owns the project and who is making the overall decisions, because that can become blurred over time working on projects. You going back to setting the objectives initially, at some point you need to understand, have you met those objectives? And it's really for the customer to own those objectives and make sure that we have achieved them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've got anything else?
I agree. I think definitely doing the research in the initial stages, externally, internally. What we sometimes see, which is actually a really big plus at the start of projects, is clients will send us kind of requirements lists, that kind of thing, with a, like a yes, no, maybe tick approach that we can work through. But it's really good to see that from clients, that they've got a clear view on what the requirements are. They know what they're looking for. They've also got things on there, that are really non-negotiables, things that are nice to haves. And I think that's really good in the first initial stages, so everybody knows, where we're working from, where we're hoping to end up. I think that's really helpful. Something I'd recommend for sure.
Just thinking, I suppose, from more of a procurement perspective, some of the things I get more involved in that initial stage with the customer is the supplier integrations and how they're interacting with key suppliers they've got in place already. And now some of those suppliers may be critical to the business in terms of the products or services they're providing. There seems to be less of a consideration sometimes of how those suppliers are going to interact now there's a new system in place. So things that I get involved in around punch out integrations to suppliers and the review of those suppliers' pricing. Some of those things sort of come out in the wash when you're going live, and suddenly there's this afterthought of, oh, we need an integration to, X supplier. That supplier may not even have that in place. So it's do you get asked about that up front? From my perspective, it seems to be sort of a secondary step almost, but it's probably something that should be considered up front.
Sorry,
I mean, yeah, typically I would expect that we'd know those requirements early doors and would build that into the project. What I was going to say in terms of the finance system you're using is what we can leverage from the existing functionality in the finance system is quite important to understand. So, some of these systems don't even hold budgets in the finance system, and we have to hold it in Compleat. So just getting an understanding of which supplier they're using for their finance system and what they've been able to achieve with that supplier is also important.
Yeah, it's a good point, because when we get involved in initial projects implementation, we'll start rolling out, but in the same time we'll start to get data and information on what suppliers they're using, what pricing they're paying, how much they're spending in categories. And for some businesses, the first time they've really had that view of where the money is going, and we would like to again get ahead of that up front as well. And there's quite a few of the schools we're working with at the moment and multi-site trusts, they're all using similar finance systems, and the reporting that comes out of that is only as good, like any system, as what you put into it historically. So if there's been no control in the purchasing process up until this point, what we see is lots of orders going to various nominal codings, different account structures that don't make as much sense as they should. We can get that reporting and within our team start to analyze that data to look at where consolidation of suppliers as a first point could happen. So office supplies is one we start with a lot of the time, because that's one that is quite an emotional subject for people. If you change the pens people are using, then they may get upset about that if they haven't been told. So suddenly you're using 5, 6, 7 different suppliers for the same product at different pricing. Those businesses have no idea. And then they want to punch out integration for all of those because that's the supply base they think they're working with. So
yeah,
I
mean, certainly if you're thinking of putting in a piece of software like ours, to do that consolidation work in your finance system before you take this project on would be a very good idea, because there's nothing worse than coming across a customer that's got 6, 7, 8 different entities in their finance systems, all with a different chart of accounts, all with their own set of creditor codes. That that reference data is really key in how we configure Compleat and how complicated our configuration is in Compleat. So if you have a shared common set of accounts and creditors across your finance system, that's a huge advantage when implementing a piece of software like ours.
That's an interesting point, because you could do the review up front, and we certainly do get involved with some customers probably 6 months in some cases before they actually implement the software, to get ahead of that. So I think the more we can do that, because you're absolutely right. If you're using, some of the business we're working with, around one I'm working on, but got about 180 million spend a year going through. They've got 7,000 suppliers, and I think 150 of those were for the same product.
Right.
Just because they've got a multi-site business, lots of different end users ordering the same things from different places, different prices, no control, no visibility. So consolidating that before you go live makes total sense, because
I mean, if you want to control which suppliers they're using in our software, which is entirely possible, we allow you to have approved supplier lists, then doing that consolidation up front is going to be advantageous. You don't really want to be doing that once you're live, because you've missed the opportunity to get it all set in stone from day one.
So do procurement get that involved with you necessarily on the implementation side? Because I think we again get involved with procurement probably at the starting point when they're looking to work out which solution to use and hopefully choosing us. But then it sort of goes away again, and then we get back involved once the system's live. But it sounds like they should be more involved throughout the process.
I mean, it does depend on the size of the organisation and what procurement capacity they've got. But certainly, if the organisation is big enough to have a dedicated procurement team, then I would be getting them involved from the beginning. Because there's a lot of functionality in our software that can help them, police what the users are doing and who they go into for their supplies.
Key point is getting ahead of the process as early as possible, really, and that's where we get the biggest wins.
Guys, I'm sorry to jump back in here because I know there's a whole load more that you lot were planning on talking through, but we are on a little bit of a deadline on a 45-minute webinar, and there's been some really interesting questions that have been posed, and a couple of things that came up in the build up to this as well, and a couple where I think actually you guys probably touched on this right at the start, and then as people have dialed in and they've missed those very intro bits. So I wouldn't normally grab 10 minutes for questions, but I think there's a couple here that might need a little bit of conversation or warrant a little bit of conversation. There was one very specific one, which was actually for Caitlin. And it was, the person's asking, when you're talking to people at the start of this process, are the conversations significantly different if they're replacing an existing platform or if they're brand new coming into the market? What's that conversation look like at those early stages, and what's that like for you and your team?
So I think that's a good question. I think a lot of the businesses that I work with primarily don't have an existing system in place, so there isn't one to replace. However, if there was one, invariably there's going to be some different questions. Fundamentally, I think the key questions are the same. What's your current process, and what maybe isn't working or is working? What are the pain points, and what would you be looking to achieve if you are to replace this system? So I think that still forms the main bulk of the conversation. I guess from a transfer perspective, you know, there's going to be a period of implementation, etc., getting rid of the old system to put the new one in. So I might bring in, you know, more experts from our side that are slightly more technical than me to go over that side of things, but equally might include, you know, more people their side to talk that through as well. So definitely still pretty much the same conversation, but there's some differences for sure.
Cool, thank you very much. One of your points there, Max, about people getting attached to their pens, definitely something we see, even from the other side of the coin, from marketing. As soon as you want to send out new pens to everybody with a new brand on it, if they haven't got the right soft touch on there or whatever it may be, then all hell breaks loose.
It's a real thing, yep.
It is. It's shocking as well. There was another question that came up, and it was asking, for an organisation that hasn't got anything in place at the moment, are they better off to look at a full P2P solution, or would you suggest that for larger organisations they're better off focusing on a single process or a single department or part of the business and to work from there? And Will, I suppose over to you on that one to start with.
We certainly have had some customers that have joined us just to process their invoices. So by bringing the invoices into our system, we can introduce approval workflow. You're going paperless straight away. And that's going to bring visibility of the product around the organisation just by putting the invoices around. So if you could do that initially, that is a good introduction to the software. People become familiar with it, how to review the invoices. So then adding the P2P cycle is it's going to be easier second time around to come and do that. So if they are nervous about the full P2P from day one, we can go down the invoice only route.
Yeah, help out novices out there as they're trying to kick off. Another question that was asked is, how often do we come across projects that collapse because there hasn't been a team set up in the early phases to help steer the direction? Max, do you want to start there, and then we'll ping that round, the three of you?
Probably say more Will, actually, on that one. You might have come across that more than I have.
Well, not. No, I mean, I don't have projects that collapse. I don't think I've ever had a project that's collapsed on me. I'll have worked around it and will have got it going. So, no, I've never had a failed implementation, as it were, but we may have had to change various parts of the expectations as we go through. But no, we've always managed to get an approved design up and running and live and being used. So it's not a concern to me that I would lose a customer from not having the right team together. I would make sure that the requirements I gather are correct for their requirement. And if they're not, if you put it out in front of the users and you find they've got a completely different idea of how it should be used, then we can make those adjustments. But I wouldn't let that happen.
Okay. Once they're signed and it's sealed and delivered.
Almost, yeah.
Caitlin, what about for yourself again at that really early phase where people are still doing the digging around what they might like? Do you find people that seem to be really keen and really, we're going to do this, and maybe you're only talking to one or two people? Does it often then drift or slip away and maybe come back another day with more people involved? Or
yeah, I think quite often we would maybe start with an initial two people, usually in finance. But something that we would always recommend as part of our process is that we would have quite an in-depth demo of the software. And that would be something we do quite quickly after the initial kind of qualification of requirements. And it would be then that we would, let the people that we've been speaking to initially invite other people from multiple departments to that demo so that we can include them. They can ask the questions that are important to them initially, and we can get a bit of that investment, commitment buy-in, that as we go through the project, it isn't going to fizzle or collapse because we've included them in the initial stages. I think that's the key thing. And often if people don't want to include other people from other departments, that's then a question to say, well, why not? I think you rather should. So yeah.
A bit of a red flag.
Potentially.
No, we don't want to tell anybody else we're doing this. Okay. One, and actually, I think you guys did touch on this one earlier on. It's somebody saying that their IT team often push back when they try and do things as a finance team. When they're trying to do things, you know, they've got IT pushing back, saying, "Oh no, we can build this ourselves. We can do this ourselves," or whatever that may be. Any suggestions or recommendations from you guys as to how a senior finance person can help alleviate that, or avoid it, or engage it, or what that might look like?
It's just by being open and engaging in the first place with the IT team, making sure they know what's coming on board and asking for their input. Not faking it, but you know, you're interested in the IT's opinion. Is there things that they want the system to do, that the IT department want the system to do? By just engaging them early on and bringing them on board would hopefully smooth things out.
Okay, fantastic. Got a couple more minutes. What else did we have here? We've done that one. If I asked each of you to try and wrap this up with one tip that people could take away with them today to make this, as you know, their next project a success, you know, if you can distill it into one key tip, what would that be?
For me, it's always keep things simple. Don't over egg it on the first run. You know, we need to get this system out live, get customers and users engaging with it, get their feedback, and then we can tweak the system to those requirements at a later date. But the key thing is getting the system in front of users and getting them using it. And to do that, you have to keep things simple. Thank you.
I think from my perspective, it's just communication on the different costs of what's being put in front of a customer and what's been recommended. We're doing that for very specific reasons, and we get people trying to shave costs off, trying to do it for the lowest cost possible. We advise solutions on them being the best fit and the best possible solution for that customer. So I think there's that degree of cynicism within a sales process to say we're trying to just bump up our costs, and we're actually recommending solutions that really should fit that customer. So I don't think cutting corners is a good thing in these sort of projects. We do things for a very specific reason. So we want to work with you in the right way.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I think my biggest tip would be just have as clear the requirements as you can initially, and part of that kind of ties in with what Max was saying, that we have lots of products and solutions that Compleat which can fit all businesses, but the requirements, as early on as we can get those in there clear and set out, we can then recommend the best next step from there, the best solution for you, which just helps them and it helps us as well, which is really good in working together on this.
That's great, guys. Well, look, we're at time, so I think that's a really nice wrap-up point there. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, the three of you, for your time and sharing these points of wisdom with the audience. I think we've probably got another session's worth at least that we could schedule on this one and have you guys talking through some more. So maybe that's something we put our heads together and put it in place maybe after the summer holidays. I know we're approaching that point now with schools breaking up. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and for those of you that are here, we will share recordings, etc. In due course.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.
The future is now.